Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Jason Statham is putting the sting on the bad guys as the Beekeeper. Adam Clay, played by Jason Statham, is a retired beekeeper, a secret clandestine organisation living quietly in a barn he rents from Eloise Parker, played by Felicia Rashad. When Eloise takes her own life after losing all of her money in a phishing scam, Adam becomes determined to track down who is responsible and unravels a conspiracy leading to companies owned by Derek Danforth, played by Josh Hutcherson, and nothing is going to stop Adam from going right to the top of the hive. The Beekeeper is a teaming of two talents with rather dubious reputations in the action genre. On the one hand, we have director David Ayer, who, full credit to him, I have liked some of his work in the past, Fury in particular, but ever since that incredibly awful Suicide Squad movie has pretty much been on a losing streak. And on the other hand, we have writer Kurt Wimmer, and if you're a long-time fan of this channel, you know that I have a lot of issues with Wimmer's work, going right back to Equilibrium, and somehow Wimmer has managed to fail upwards as a writer, despite the fact that he has credits like Ultraviolet, Law-Abiding Citizen, the remakes of Total Recall or Point Break, all terrible, but somehow Wimmer still writes major action movies. I don't get it. So putting these two together is very much the opposite of a dream team, and I do have to admit that I felt some bad buzz towards the Beekeeper. So I was actually kind of surprised at how entertained I was at it, but not because it's good, but because it is kind of bad in an entertaining way. Full disclosure, by the way, I am reviewing this from a screener, but they have no input over this review, nor do they get to see it before I post it. It becomes very apparent fairly early on in The Beekeeper exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to launch a new franchise for Jason Statham, and it does that by shamelessly pilfering from two of the biggest action franchises of the last decade, The Equalizer and John Wick, and just putting them together into the same character. You can clearly see traits of both of them in The Beekeeper. The fact that the title character, Clay, of course not his real name, much like McCall in the Equalizer movies, he's a retired agent of a secret clandestine organisation, and he gets called out to help the underprivileged that are being exploited by criminal enterprises that are above the touch of the law, much like Denzel Washington's Equalizer in those movies. But of course, you also have the fact that he's avenging the death of someone that he loved in the same way that John Wick is as well. And those comparisons only become more evident the more the movie goes on, particularly in a sequence where he takes out a group of bad guys in a barn and he's stringing them up from the ceiling. And at that point, I was having severe deja vu of the climax of the first Equalizer movie, where Denzel Washington is pretty much doing the same thing in a hardware store. But the thing is, John Wick and McCall of the Equalizer movies, they had personalities, we knew what their characters were about, and they were both played by charismatic performers. And Statham can be a charismatic performer. He might not have a huge amount of range, but still, he can be surprisingly charming and self-effacing despite being a tough guy. And yet in The Beekeeper, he's remarkably stoic, and the script gives him very little to play. There's not a lot to the character of Clay. Largely, all that we do know about him is that he likes bees, he has a high moral compass, he's very good at beating up bad guys, and he likes bee puns. That's the defining character trait of Statham in this movie. He's dropping more bee puns than Arnold Schwarzenegger dropped ice puns as Mr. Freeze in Batman and Robin. But imagine that if it was delivered with absolute po-faced seriousness like Statham does here. It's absolutely hilarious. He's dropping hornets into every single conversation, even when it's not necessary. Sometimes they leave them dealing with the hornets. Sometimes I like to smoke out the hornets as he's pouring gasoline on people's desks. It's amazing. Like, it's not even even up to the level of allegory. It's just straight up mixed metaphors. But Statham has never been more Seagal-like than he is in this movie. For a start, he has very little dialogue, and what little there is often quite monosyllabic. He's just showing up largely for the action set pieces, and he's just taking them on completely single-handed, and they lay not a single scratch on him for most of the movie. In fact, a lot of the time in the fight sequences, they don't get a hand on him. He's just decimating wave after wave of bad guys, exactly in the same way that Seagal is often completely invincible in his movies. And then when the action beats die down, Statham just disappears for extended stretches of the movie. There's 10-minute stretches of The Beekeeper where Statham is just completely off screen. So a lot of the actual plot and exposition of the movie is actually handled by an FBI agent following him, played by Emmy Raver-Lampman, who is the daughter of Eloise, the woman the Beekeeper was renting the barn from in the first place. And despite the fact that her mother has recently passed by her own hand, she doesn't seem to have all that much grief about it. In fact, aside from a bit of mild day drinking and showing up to a crime scene with a hangover, she just seems to just handle it like any other case, which is a little bit odd because you might think that it's personally related to her mother. That might actually be a bit of a conflict of interest and she might need to be reassigned or maybe taken off on leave, but no, she just follows the Beekeeper despite all this. And I have to admit that this performance is absolutely bizarre. There are moments where she's looking at the barn as it's been burnt out later, and she just offhandedly goes, "I lost my virginity in that barn." What? What does that have to do with anything? Why did she need to even mention that? There's another moment where she takes a beekeeping book out of a burnt out petrol station, and later she's reading it, and she goes, "Bees are interesting little shits." I mean, full credit to the actress for trying to deliver those pearls of wisdom in the dialogue. This character only exists to deliver exposition because there are long patches where Statham just disappears. We don't get any sense of his working or trying to uncover the conspiracy for himself a lot of the time. We had to have these characters try and pull all the pieces together after Statham's already done it and try to work out what exactly he's doing. It's very weird. It means that we're always at a distance from Clay as a character. He's an enigma, but not in a good way. He's just not interesting. It's just not on screen a lot of the time, and he doesn't seem to have any kind of interior life. It's a very odd scripting choice. Oh, and I completely forgot to mention the early scene where Verona, the FBI agent, is talking to Clay at her mother's table and says something to the effect of, "I'm detecting some British Isles lurking in your accent." Really? Was it particularly hiding at all? This is Jason Statham we're talking about. That's like having a conversation with Jean-Claude Van Damme and going, "You sound a little bit Belgian." No kidding! And when I mention this stuff, it makes it sound like the movie is self-aware and tongue-in-cheek. And yeah, there are a couple of moments where characters go, "Oh, what, you ticked off a beekeeper? Big deal." But the thing is, the film is actually remarkably serious and sincere, despite the fact that it's absolutely ridiculous. Jason Statham is actually listed as a producer on this movie, and I genuinely think that he believes in this film because it tackles with the social issue of the elderly getting scammed. That's a big problem in society these days, and the movie pretty much uses it as its equivalent of John Wick's dog getting killed. Like, this is the act that's going to instigate and justify the entire rest of the narrative, no matter how wild and crazy it gets from that point. So the opening 10 minutes of the movie largely focuses on Felicia Rashad as the victim of this phishing scam, and she delivers a actually genuinely realistic and heartbreaking performance as someone that is not especially tech literate, getting led down the garden path. She is just hook, line and sinker for this scam, and then when she realises exactly what has happened, It's absolutely devastating. You can see how much she feels like her life has been destroyed in one single moment. That is a hard shot of reality. But while all this is going on, the movie cuts to the other side of the line at the call centre, where they got these massive TV screens in the background, neon fluorescent lighting in the ceiling, rows upon rows of people sat at their computers. It's like an esports convention, complete with a hooting and hollering host who is cackling away as this poor woman falls for his scam. It is absolutely cartoonish and over the top to the point where any semblance of reality just goes right out the window. But later in the movie, they manage to top this because in another call centre, they've literally got the faces of scammed elderly people in the background on those TV screens. You see just these sad old faces of people that they've exploited just to really hammer this home, in case the fact that he's constantly dropping the F-bomb and being incredibly unsavoury wasn't a key enough that these are awful, terrible people. Essentially, a lot of the first half of the film is Statham just working his way through a bunch of obvious straw men, the kind of people that are so absolutely defenceless that when he corners them, they just whimper, going, "Don't hurt me, bro! Don't hurt me, bro! I can get you an NFT!" That's the kind of people that he's taking down for a lot of the first half of the movie, and largely it relies on the audience's satisfaction of seeing these absolute a-holes get what they deserve, largely getting pulled off the end of a bridge by a truck screaming as they die. And chief amongst these is Josh Hutcherson as Derek Danforth, a coke-snorting nepo baby, and Hutcherson is clearly having way more fun with this role than he was with the entirety of Five Nights at Freddy's, playing an amalgamation of Logan Paul and Alfie Allen from John Wick, who spends most of his time skateboarding around the office and generally being quite insufferable, the kind of person that waltzes up at a party and goes, "I think this cryptocurrency's really gonna blow up, bro." Hutcherson is reveling in getting to play someone just absolutely reprehensible and is just riding on the coattails of his vastly successful mother, who has managed to parlay that into a political career and is clearly not so subtly based on Hillary Clinton, and is played in this film's case by Jenna Redgrave, who seems to be taking the material maybe a little bit too seriously, especially in the later section of the movie, and her company is under the control of Jeremy Irons, who is the former director of the CIA, and Irons is way overqualified for this kind of material, basically being Michael Nyqvist from the first John Wick, the only person that is aware of just how screwed Derek is in his situation, even as he tries to mop it up. But it eventually devolves into him providing a bit of gravitas to several Seagal speeches delivered to multiple sets of characters. If you've ever seen a Steven Seagal movie, there's always a point where one of the characters gives a glowing speech about Seagal's character, saying that he's the baddest man who ever badded, he's unstoppable, and he's coming for you. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Midway through the movie, Irons walks into a room of heavily armed former Navy SEALs and gives them this big speech about the Beekeeper, ultimately telling them that compared to him, they're all pussies. Unfortunately, as the film progresses, Irons becomes much less important, and ultimately, you wonder why his character is in the movie after the halfway point, because he doesn't seem to have a role anymore, especially given the way he's flippantly discarded near the end of the film. Although spare a thought for Minnie Driver, who plays the current director of the CIA that Irons draws in for Hell, who appears to have had most of her role left on the cutting room floor, because she only appears in a handful of very brief scenes in the middle of the movie despite prominent billing, and then just completely disappears. I hope she got paid well, but mostly the Beekeeper evades a revolving door of intelligence organisations like the FBI and the CIA as he goes further and further up the conspiracy, and when he reveals just how high up it goes, I was actually laughing out of my chair at that moment. I was hysterical, not least of which because genuinely it's accompanied with a big dramatic dun 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 musical stinger which only amplified the absolute silliness of it. But after a certain point, that catharsis in seeing Statham absolutely annihilate a group of scammers starts to wear off as he starts to battle against ostensibly more formidable opponents, and he just goes through them like a knife through warm butter. It's the kind of movie where Statham's Clay walks deliberately into the middle of a group of heavily armed FBI guys standing outside of a building that roughly outnumber him about 10-1 or so, and he just decimates them without any of them laying a hand on him whatsoever, and he walks into the building barely even ruffled. And this goes back to the fact this was written by Kurt Wimmer. You might recall in those reviews way back when mentioning that Wimmer really likes his invincible heroes. He doesn't like tension or conflict in his action scenes. He likes his action heroes to be absolutely dominant. And the thing is, that isn't very interesting. And you see this in The Beekeeper, where the more the action scenes start occurring, the more repetitive they start to feel, because no one actually even gets close to him until the very end of the movie. The Beekeeper never feels like he's in any kind of jeopardy, and that's the difference between something like this and John Wick. John Wick may be the Baba Yaga, but he's not completely unstoppable. In fact, John Wick often gets 7 bells knocked out of him during the fight scenes, but he gets back up again, and each of those action sequences have different choreographies. They always try and make them feel varied, and often Wick is using his wit to try and get past his opponents. That makes the fight scenes feel different. It makes them feel compelling and interesting and have some semblance of tension about them. Whereas in The Beekeeper, you really don't feel that at all, because you just know that Statham is just going to go through the next set of bad guys, and they're just going to reintroduce another bunch for him to go through in the next sequence, over and over again. Even worse, this to such an extent that it undermines the film's world building. The whole movie is setting up the idea of this secret organisation of beekeepers, agents that are nearly unkillable, and wouldn't you know it, they send a current active beekeeper after Clay to try and stop him. And you think, oh, that's interesting. In any other movie, that would be your secondary antagonist, one that he would keep bumping into over the course of the movie. They would be very similarly trained and they would know each other's tactics. Well, not in this movie, because this beekeeper comes in at a petrol station with a truck that has a minigun on the back of it, dressed like an extra out of Ayer's Suicide Squad movie, blasts that minigun, which fires out purple and green bullets like it's operated by Harley Quinn, and then they have a fight scene which maybe lasts about 30 seconds after that. Statham absolutely demolishes this woman, and then that's it. That beekeeper's dead. She's out of the movie completely. And it makes a complete mockery of this setup if Statham absolutely wrecks her in almost record time. I've seen wrestling squash matches that lasted longer than this. And then afterwards, the beekeepers basically goes, oh, well, we're not involved anymore. We're washing our hands of this. It's like if the Continental existed in John Wick and they sent one assassin after him and they basically gave up after that. That's what this is. And to me, it's frustrating because Statham can clearly still do the action stuff. He's throwing himself into the set pieces, but they're not giving him that much interesting to do until near the end of the movie when the beekeeper finally goes against a worthy opponent in the form of Taylor James's Lazarus, a crazy South African mercenary, because I guess we run through all the other henchman stereotypes by that point. But the climax of the movie, action-wise, is a fight scene between these two characters, and actually it's the best action scene in the entire movie, largely because it's a really rough knockdown battle between these two characters, and Clay actually gets hurt. He gets hurt a lot in it. They really mess each other up over the course of this sequence as they throw each other into these glass mirrored walls and things like that, and they stab each other. It's really brutal and vicious and very close quarters, and I was watching this going, this is a great fight scene. Why the hell wasn't the rest of the movie like this? The Beekeeper's a pretty bad movie, but it's an enjoyable one. It is absolutely preposterous, but it delivers itself with such a po-faced seriousness that it starts to feel like a throwback. It starts to feel like a one-man army movie that might have been headlined by Chuck Norris or Steven Seagal back in the day and made by Cannon. And it's quite slickly directed by Ayer. I just wish that as an action fan, there was a bit more variation with the action. But luckily, the goofy plotting always draws you back in because there's always some absurd next twist right around the corner. And so I'd be happy to see Statham come back for more outings as the Beekeeper, so long as they don't become self-aware. Near the end of the movie, a character actually says to Clay, "You're only human." And there was a part of me that wished that he replied, "No, I'm a bee." But maybe he shouldn't have, and that was the right call. If you like this review and you want to support The Hive, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Alternatively, you can join my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and I'm pleased to announce I've now started YouTube memberships, where you can join below this video and have similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.